Good morning, everyone. Today I have the pleasure of speaking to you about the evolution of the Charles River Basin. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay. So the Charles River Watershed Association, which for the rest of this talk will be CRWA, was formed in 1965 by a group of concerned citizens who wanted to protect the river from the threats of chemical pollution and development in the watershed area. And ever since that time, we've maintained a small but dedicated staff who've been using science advocacy and the law to make the Charles River one of the cleanest urban rivers in the country. But today I'd like to kind of delve beneath that shimmery blue surface that we all see today and kind of discuss what's lying behind the clean waters of the Charles and what that means for the future of the river and the communities around the river in the face of climate change. So the Charles River that we see today is really highly developed and much more a work of man and engineering than it is a creation of nature. You can see that there's a predominance of what we call impervious surfaces. So that would be parking lots, roadways, rooftops, and really not as much natural space as we would have seen centuries ago. So again, even the waterways themselves, the lower Charles River Basin is impounded by a dam, which really creates a much different system than what settlers would have seen when they arrived in the Boston area about 400 years ago. And this property around Boston and Cambridge has always had a lot of value because of its access to both the fresh water of the Charles River that would carry people and goods inland, as well as the Boston Harbor, which would allow for connectivity with other nations. The river is also used by about 5,000 to 20,000 people every day, depending on the weather conditions and different events that are happening around the river. And so that includes people who are walking, running, sailing, kayaking. And so with all of this use in the Charles River watershed, we know that the system is under a lot of stress. But I'd like to point out today that not all stress has to be a bad thing. And at Charles River Watershed Association, we really see this as an opportunity to grow more resilient and stronger communities that are able to cope with this high level of use. We're proud to say that the Charles River is no longer the public health hazard that it was years ago, but it's definitely a different system, as I've said, than what it was in its natural condition before it became built up into a city. And despite all the development that we have had in this region, we know that the Charles River still does provide a lot of natural resources. And so we haven't given up hope on really taking advantage of all of that. There's a lot of wildlife that really use the habitats that are available in the river, and a good amount of economic activity that has been driven in this area by the river and the wildlife. But I would like to pose the question that we might be able to have more valuable natural resources if we continue to evolve our communities strategically. So to kind of take a step back in time, when colonists first came to the Boston area about 400 years ago, the Charles River system that they saw was an estuary. And this Estuarine system provided a great number of different habitats because it was the intersection of the freshwater coming in from the Charles, the salt water coming in from Boston Harbor, and all of the surrounding coastal land. And that habitat diversity was able to support a lot of biological diversity. And in fact, estuarine systems are second only to rainforests in the biodiversity they're able to support. Furthermore, the estuarine system was very resilient. There's this wide variety of different organisms that are adapted to specific niches in an estuary, and all of these organisms are resilient to different disturbances in the system because they've adapted to deal with situations such as droughts and storm surges just by the very nature of living in a system that experiences droughts and floods over the course of daily tides. And so, sort of to further describe the specializations of these organisms, they're evolved to take advantage of these opportunities that low and high tide provide. And kind of similarly to what I'm suggesting for our communities, low and high tide could be considered stressful conditions for these organisms, but they're really taking advantage of the opportunity to access water and nutrients during high tide, and to access oxygen, and to feed during low tide. In addition, the estuarine system that we had in the Charles before the damming, around 1908, provided a lot of valuable ecosystem services that we might want to recover in the future. So, for example, a salt marsh on Thompson Island would have the advantage of being able to soak up storm surge water in its peat layers, which would be underneath all of the vegetation you see here in this photo. And it would also be able to provide a pollution filtration for any stormwater that's coming into the marsh from on land. And then, of course, another valuable ecosystem service provided by estuarine systems is the carbon storage capacity. So as these marshes build peat and accumulate more layers of decomposing material, they're able to store carbon, and they're also able to migrate. So in the face of sea level rise, the marsh is able to actually move inland and continue to provide that coastal stabilization, so long as we haven't built roads or other structures that might impede the movement of the marsh. Probably most familiar to folks in this audience would be that estuaries provide a lot of food resources for both people and wildlife. The river herring and shad runs historically were sort of a spring saving grace for both people and mammals, fish, birds that were living in the Charles River, and looking for a new food source at the end of winter. And so we had very huge runs of American shad, river herring, and then also we were actually able to support some oyster reefs and clam beds, particularly between the stretch of the river between the Massachusetts Avenue Bridge and the Millers River, which is down in Charlestown. So in addition to the fisheries value of estuarine systems, estuaries also were used for agricultural purposes, where the grasses in the salt marshes served as a food source for grazing cattle, and were also harvested as hay for building materials. But around the 1800s, we started to move away from using that type of a lifestyle. More people were moving west. The agricultural sector was moving west. Technology made it possible to do more farmland and grazing activities in upland areas. And so salt marshes and other estuarine habitats lost a lot of their value to the greater Boston community. And as a consequence, a lot of the wetland areas were actually drained, dredged, and filled to create new land that could be built up for an industrial economy. And so you can see that a little bit better here, sort of what the sequence of events were in expanding the land area in Boston. But essentially around this time period, we were starting to see a lot of mills, more than 40 mills operating on the Charles River. and a total of about 20 dams, all of which are still in place on the river today. And sort of this level of disturbance, while it supported the industrial economy, was very controversial for farmers whose land was being flooded by the dams, and also for fishermen who were not able to bring in the same haul of these anadromous fish that they previously had been catching, because the fish were unable to migrate between the harbor and the river. So one of the big phases of environmental change we've seen in the Charles River Basin was in response to this period of population growth and industrialization. So all the prosperity that sort of resulted from the industrial growth in this area attracted a lot of new residents. And so as the city's population started to expand, we started to see more problems with sewage and waste product control and the potential threats of public health problems. And so sort of the solution to this problem was to actually dam the river. And so a dam was built in 1908 on the Charles River, and that retained a permanent store of water on this previously estuarine habitat that normally would have been exposed mud flats during low tide. And this took care of the problem of hiding the pollution on the river, because around 1840, with the large population we now had in Boston, a water system was constructed, and while this did provide the luxury of indoor plumbing, the problem with that was that all of these plumbing systems discharged to the Charles River. So when we had low tide events, anything that had been dumped through the sewer system was now exposed, visible, affecting the air quality in the greater Boston area. And so by ensuring that this area was permanently covered with water, we didn't have the unsightly and odorous effects of the sewage pollution that we had previously. Unfortunately, that didn't mean that the pollution didn't stop happening. And people actually continued to swim because we didn't really know any better at the time. But fortunately, around the 1960s, 1970s, we had an environmental movement here in the United States, and people started to realize that there are pollutants out there that are affecting water quality and affecting people's ability to safely fish or boat in our waters, and that just because we can't see or smell a pollutant doesn't mean that it isn't causing harm. And so we've actually had a lot of success controlling these sorts of industrial pollutants that have very specific sources and can be tracked down easily and are easily attributable to who is responsible for addressing these problems. And so there's been a huge effort to clean up the Boston Harbor. A large part of that was with the Massachusetts Water Resources Authority and Boston Water and Sewer Commission controlling and separating their sewer infrastructure from their street stormwater infrastructure. So we found in this era that really government regulations were pretty effective in addressing these sources of pollution. So the system we have today now has much better water quality than perhaps 50 years ago, but it's still struggling to provide sort of that same functional service that we had when we had an estuarine system. So for example, the water in the Charles River Lower Basin, it's pretty stationary. It stays within that basin for about 10 days before actually flushing out. And so this creates sort of a different system where the water is much deeper and the river bottom is separated from light. And so we can't grow aquatic vegetation on the river bottom. And not to mention the fact that even if there were light, there are a lot of toxic sediments still accumulated behind the dam here on the river. And so this map kind of shows these darker areas are places where sediment has pooled up over the years. And a 2000 study by the United States Geological Survey found that the heavy metals and hydrocarbons and pesticides that have accumulated in the sediments of the Charles River lower basin are anywhere between 2 and 35 times more concentrated than in some of the other urban rivers in our country. And so we know that this bottom habitat is nowhere near able to support the diversity of life that it could. And so Charles River Watershed Association, along with some of the other state agencies that are working in the watershed, have started to do some research and quantify what some of these impacts of urbanization and dam structures are on the different wildlife that uses the river. And so essentially what this diagram is showing is that we would expect to see in areas that are very heavily polluted, only very tolerant organisms. So we're looking at things like worms, bottom-feeding fish, not necessarily the desirable ecological community for this river. And Charles River Watershed Association has seen evidence that we do have a lot of pollution impacts through monitoring benthic macroinvertebrates, or small insects and mollusks that live on the river bottom. And so we started working with volunteer citizen scientists in 2013 to collect data from various tributaries to the Charles River, as well as a couple of locations along the main stem of the river itself. And as you can see, that showed that we had pretty much fair and poor water quality at all of the sites that we monitored. In 2002, Charles River Watershed Association also worked with the state to study the fish communities in the river. And the takeaway message from this diagram is that we've really got a predominantly generalist community of fishes. So these are fishes that are not necessarily restricted to healthy riverine habitats. And so sort of the problem that we're seeing now and kind of where we're trying to head in the future is that we're trying to face problems that are more complex than the issues that have been addressed in the basin in the past. So we're trying to adapt to climate change, and we're also trying to deal with community level land use issues such as eutrophication and stormwater runoff. And sort of what we're proposing as a strategy for addressing these challenges is to follow some smart growth and green infrastructure principles and do our best to sort of mimic nature, which, as has been said previously, has been evolving for billions of years and has plenty of experience coming up with solutions to these types of problems. And here's a few illustrations of examples of places where you can see these types of principles in action nearby. So we've got some designs set up for new green infrastructure on the Harvard Greenway. The Alewife wetland has already been constructed, and that's really providing a huge water quality benefit to Alewife Brook. And one of the projects that'll be open to the public this summer is the restoration of the Muddy River in Boston and Brookline. And really one of the big takeaways for us about this green infrastructure strategy is that it provides multiple benefits and not just environmental benefits to our communities. And so kind of my conclusions from this presentation were that although biodiversity is fragile, and landscape level changes can be difficult to reverse, if we use these smart growth and green infrastructure principles to address the new complex watershed management challenges we see today, we might be able to transform the landscape in a way that we won't regret and we won't want to change a couple of decades down the line. And personally, I say think like a mummy chug or whatever your favorite estuarine creature is, because they are very flexible and resilient and well adapted, and that's exactly what we want to do in the Charles River watershed. Thank you.